first start off by telling you a little bit about WRAP. We are a global nonprofit team of experts that focuses on economic and environmental sustainability, and we provide assistance to government officials and regulators on a broad range of energy and environmental issues. Our two speakers today are Jim Lazar, and Jim Lazar is a very well-renowned economist. He has maintained a consulting practice since 1982 and is the principal author of handbooks and articles on various aspects of utility regulation and has been recognized as one of the top experts in the field. Next slide. Today's rate design session, we're calling it 101, and basically it is an overview of cost allocation and current residential rate designs. We're going to have another webinar in next week, which we encourage you to attend, called Rate Design 201. And in that webinar, we are going to get more into the weeds, talk about cost allocation and the transition from cost to rates, time varying and dynamic rates, net metering and alternatives, which is very much at the forefront today in a lot of regulatory discussions. Next. Just as a matter of housekeeping, we have here a visual for you. If you look at the side of your screen, you have an opportunity, if you want to ask questions, to enter a question for the staff along where that blue arrow is shown. We already have a number of questions that we've gotten from folks, and we thank you very much for these questions. What we're going to try to do today is cover as many of the questions as we can during the time allotted for this call, but we will be staying on the line for an extra half hour to answer other questions. And I'm going to try to prioritize them, so if your question doesn't get answered, it's most likely a question that's more applicable to the webinar next week, and we would encourage you to tune in and ask your question then. And if that's not going to work for you, you can contact us at WRAP, and we'll try to send you an answer. Next slide. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jim Lazar, who's going to begin the presentation.
Well, good morning. I'm glad you could join us today. I am unmuted. Am I there?
Yes.
Good. We're going to start with just a few minutes on dividing up the revenue requirement. Next week's webinar will get into cost allocation studies a little more in depth. There are two basic families of methodologies that are used for dividing up the revenue requirement by utility regulators. One are embedded cost studies that look backwards at the actual costs on the system, that is, those costs for power plants, distribution, and operations that are built into the revenue requirement. The other approach are marginal cost studies that look forward. What would it cost us to build a new system today? They often produce different results. There are about 30 states that use embedded cost studies and about 20 states that use marginal cost studies. Because the majority of states use embedded cost studies, I'm going to start with a very simple view of how an embedded cost study works. It begins with the utilities revenue requirement here at the top, and that gets functionalized into production, transmission, and distribution costs. And then those functionalized costs get classified into customer-related, demand-related, and energy-related costs. And finally, those costs, once classified, get divided among various customer classes. Now, classification really matters. Generation and distribution are the big cost categories. If costs are classified as demand-related, they tend to fall more heavily on residential and small commercial customers. And if costs are classified as customer-related, they tend to fall most heavily on residential and small commercial customers. So in rate cases, the classification deliberations are often among the most strenuous in a rate case. With different classes of customer representatives arguing for different methodologies. When we're all done, though, we come up with some components of electric rates, and I'm going to spend most of the rest of today talking about how those are collected in rates. And here on the left, you see the residential rates with power supply in blue being the biggest part of the cost. Transmission is a small slice. Distribution is a big part. And up at the top in green, the customer billing related costs are a pretty small part of the total. So I'm going to now touch on a little bit of some basic rate design terminology. First of all, the term customer charge. When I use that term, I'm meaning a monthly charge that applies independent of consumption. In some places it's called a basic charge, a standing charge, a meter charge, a service charge. It has a number of names, but they all pretty much mean the same thing. The next are energy charges, and this is what most residential customers see, is a price per kilowatt hour. It may be in more than one time period. It may be in more than one block. It may be seasonal. The blocks and the time periods may vary from season to season, but if it's a per kilowatt hour charge, we're referring to that as an energy charge. And finally, there are demand charges, which we mostly see in commercial rates, but in next week's webinar, we'll talk about some demand charge approaches for residential rates. That's a monthly fee. It's usually based on the highest hourly usage during the month, sometimes during the year, but usually the highest usage during the month gets reflected in a demand charge. So with that, I'm going to now take a little bit of a gallop through residential rate types from simple to complex and talk about what each of the components in the rates is designed to recover. And you'll be able to tie together the graphic I had earlier showing the components of the rates and see how those are recovered. I'm going to talk first about a declining block rate, then a flat rate, then inclining block rates, seasonal rates, time of use rates that incorporate inclining blocks, and that'll be our topics for today. And our next webinar will be talking about critical peak pricing and real-time pricing, but those are going to be part of our discussion on November 14th. So the first rate I'm showing is a relatively archaic rate design form, a declining block rate. This particular one is from Ohio. It has a $4.25 customer charge, which is about the cost of customer billing and collection. And then a rate for the first 800 kilowatt hours that covers most of the system costs. And then additional usage is priced at a lower rate because customers have already paid for most of the system costs. Now, this is not the total price. People say many of the rates I will show have extensive tariff riders that add significant costs to the base tariff, and that's true in Ohio. But those tariff riders almost never change the underlying rate design. So as I show rates, if they don't look like they're as high as you were expecting them, it's because the tariff riders are mostly, it's because the tariff riders are missing. So the next is a declining seasonal block rate. And this one is Mid-American in Ohio. It's got a customer charge of $8.50 a month. That's a little above the cost of billing and collection and may include the cost of the meter. The summer rate is a flat rate of 10.5 cents, and the winter rate is a declining block rate at 8 cents and 4.5. So this rate design is recovering all the costs of peaking plants plus some of the cost of baseload plants in the summer. And the balance of the winter rates are basically related to baseload resources, and in the end block pretty much just fuel and purchase power and operating costs. Now, the most common rate out of about 3,000 electric utilities in the country, my guess is about half of them have residential flat rates. This one's from Indiana with a customer charge of $7.30, which is, billing, collection, and the meter, something like that in that rate. And then an energy charge that applies to all kilowatt hours in all months. And while that's the most common rate design among the 3,000 utilities, it's not the most common rate design that we see for the larger utilities that are regulated. You see this primarily in the consumer-owned utilities. Now, one thing we do see in restructured regions, New England, Ohio, Texas, and a few other places, is unbundling of rates, showing in this case a Montana utility with the customer charge of $5.25 a month, that's sort of billing and collection costs. A delivery charge, about 3 cents a kilowatt hour, that's for all the transmission and distribution services. And then a power charge of 6.5 cents for all of the costs of power plants and fuel. Many of the unbundled rates certainly get a lot more complicated than this, and we'll talk about that at the end of today's webinar. But this is a simple view of an unbundled flat rate. So the next one is a seasonal flat rate. The first one, a summer peaking utility, Xcel Energy in Minnesota, a customer charge of $8 a month, a summer rate around 8.5 cents, a winter rate about 7.5 cents. So this utility is recovering its peaker costs in the summer rate and only baseload costs in the winter rate. At the bottom I have Newfoundland Power. That's a winter peaking utility. It doesn't have a customer charge, but the summer rate about 9.5 cents, the winter rate about 12 cents. So seasonal rates can go either direction depending upon what the seasonal demand of the utility is when its customers have their highest loads. Now the most common residential rate design in the world, and RAP does work globally, is the inclining block rate design. It's pretty much universal in Asia, China, India, Indonesia. It's very common in Africa. We see a lot of it in the western United States and in other parts of the U.S. The goals of an inclining block rate design are pretty clear. For many of them are used to allocate low-cost resources in a first block, whether it's hydro or some other low-cost resource. Is to recognize the load characteristics of customers, that higher use customers are more likely to have air conditioning and therefore are going to be much peakier in their usage. Encouragement of conservation is certainly one goal that's commonly experienced in regulators deciding to implement inclining block rates. Providing essential needs for all customers at an affordable cost, a lifeline rate concept or baseline rate concept that many states adopted back in the 1980 era as a result of hearings that they held under the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act. And finally, targeting benefits to low-income customers, because the vast majority, but not all, the vast majority of low-income consumers use below average amounts of electricity. So all of these play into the choice of regulators to implement inclining block rates. So now I'm going to show a simple example. This is the City of Palo Alto utility, municipal utility in California with no customer charge. This is a utility that also bills customers for water and sewer and other services. And they're going to be billing customers anyway, so they don't add a customer charge to the electric tariff. And in the first 300 kilowatt hours, that's basically lights and appliances, a little under 10 cents a kilowatt hour. And once you get above 600 kilowatt hours in the third block, it's over 17 cents. And over 600 in Palo Alto is mostly air conditioning, although there may be some other loads, swimming pools and that sort of thing, that run into that block. That's a pretty simple inclining block rate. Now I've got to take a minute here, and this is a little bit busy, to talk about how an inclining block rate design affects most of the consumption. Because some people think that if you set the first block low and the second block high, you're just encouraging people to consume more power in the first block. And that doesn't happen because almost everybody consumes more than the first block in a well-designed inclining block rate. Here I've got an example of how the customer usage breaks down for a urban utility in California. So it has a much lower average usage perhaps than your utility. 526 kilowatt hours a month is the average residential usage. In the first block of 0 to 250 kilowatt hours, There's 29% of the customers use 250 or less. But those customers only consume about 8% of the electricity. 92% of the electricity here in the last column is sold to customers whose usage exceeds 250. So for this utility, if we set an inclining block rate at 50% of average use, 250 kilowatt hours, 8% of the consumption would be subject to a lower price and an incentive to use more, and 92% of the consumption would be by customers over 250 kilowatt hours who in that inclining block rate design would have an incentive to use less electricity. And this also shows what would happen with a multi-block rate. Even if you had a second block at 250 to 500, still 70% of the 69% of the consumption would be to customers above 500 who would see a third block rate. So an inclining block rate that's well designed addresses nearly all of the consumption. 29% of the customers, 8% of the energy subject to using more because of a lower price, 92% of the consumption using less because of a higher price. So now I'm going to move on to some of these more complex rates. This one's a seasonal plus inclining block rate from Arizona Public Service. Now they have an optional time of use rate, and many large customers are moving to the time of use rates and away from this rate design. But this is the default rate design in Arizona. And in the winter months, it's a flat rate for all kilowatt hours. But in the summer period, it's a fairly steep inclining block rate designed to capture air conditioning in the third and fourth block. That air conditioning is very unpredictable usage, it's very seasonal usage, and it's very peak-oriented usage. So it's much more expensive to serve than the lights and appliances usage. Now, an inclining block rate can be a seasonal rate, and many people realize this as soon as they see it graphically. In this case, I have got a individual customer's usage in a utility where the inclining block rate is set at 500 kilowatt hours. In 7 months of the year, November, December through May, the customer is below 500 and only sees the first block rate. In the summer months, when their use goes up for air conditioning, they're in the second block rate. That second block becomes their decision pricing block, the price on which they decide whether to use more electricity or not. So in the summer, they see a higher rate at the margin than they do in the winter. In that manner, an inclining block rate sort of becomes a form of a seasonal rate. Now I'm going to touch a little bit on time of use rates, although we're going to spend more time on that, on time varying rates in next week's webinar. This one's from Georgia Power is quite an extreme one, with a $10 a month customer charge, that sort of billing collection in the meter. And as the customer-specific costs and the customer charge, an on-peak rate of 20 cents and an off-peak rate of 4.6 cents. It's a very steep time of use rate. There are several adders, including a fairly hefty fuel adder that applies to all of these, both these on-peak and off-peak rates. So that 4.6 isn't the whole thing. This utility is basically recovering the vast majority of its generation, transmission, and distribution costs in the on-peak rate, and only a small contribution to those costs in the off-peak rate. It should be pretty effective at getting people to leave their thermostats higher until 7 p.m. and to shift their laundry into nights and weekends. This next rate combines time of use and seasonal rate elements. This one's from Tucson, Arizona. A customer charge that's certainly above the level required to recover billing and collection. So it's recovering meter, maybe some distribution costs. It's a summer and winter, there's an on-peak rate and an off-peak rate. They're both higher in the summer than they are in the winter. This both reflects the high summer seasonality of use and peak loads in Arizona, and also the fact that many people in the higher altitude areas around Arizona have electric heat, and without that lower rate in the winter off-peak, they would have very high heating bills. And we do see a number of utilities using some combination of pricing that provides electric heat customers a low price source of power in the winter. This is a fixed period time of use rate with an inclining block rate design. Now, California has these, but they're much too complicated to show on a simple screen. So I've created a sort of a hypothetical one with a $5 a month customer charge to cover billing and collection costs, an off-peak rate of 10 cents that covers baseload costs and some distribution costs, an on-peak price of 20 cents a kilowatt hour that covers peaking and baseload costs plus distribution, and then a baseline credit for the first 500 kilowatt hours whenever they occur. That's the simplest way to integrate an inclining block rate design. So the customers who actually uses less than 500 kilowatt hours a month is seeing an effective rate of 6 cents off peak and 16 cents off peak, and everybody above 500 would see 10 and 20, but still get that credit for their first 500 kilowatt hours, providing a powerful signal that usage above 500 is more expensive, and a powerful signal that usage on peak is more expensive. So that's sort of the simple residential rate designs. Next week's webinar, we're going to go into a little more detail on cost allocation principles, both marginal and embedded cost studies. We'll talk about more advanced residential pricing, critical peak pricing, real-time pricing, and we'll talk about net metering and alternatives to net metering. And at that, I'm going to take a little break and ask Janine if we have clarifying questions.
Jim, this is Deb.
Jim, at this point
the first question just came in. I haven't even had time to forward it to Janine, so I'm just going to read this first one. So just to clarify, all residents get 6 cents a kilowatt hour for the first 500 kilowatt hours? I'm backing up now to the fixed period time of use rate with inclining block. If a customer used 250 on peak and 250 off peak, their average cost would be 15 cents, but they would get a 4-cent credit. If they used 400 off peak and 100 on peak, their average cost would only be 12 cents, but they would still get a 4-cent a kilowatt hour credit against that. As the use goes above 500, the credit, the 4-cent credit, just turns into a $20 a month discount on the bill. It doesn't matter when their consumption occurs. So is that it for clarification?
There are no further questions for clarification, I believe. Is that correct?
All right.
Yes, that's correct. We do have one question that is coming up yet.
All right. So the next topic that I'm going to take up is sort of the current trend in residential rate design, which is utilities seeking higher customer charges. What I put here is a table I put together a couple months ago of the customer charges for the 9 largest U.S. electric utilities. These 9 utilities serve 1 in 6 Americans, so this is a whole lot of people represented here. And the other 2,991 utilities serve 5 out of 6. The top 3 have either no customer charge or one that is below the cost of billing and collection. So in those cases, the regulators have decided that substantially all of the utilities costs should be reflected in usage costs. The next four, between $6 and $9 a month, have customer charges that reflect the costs of billing, collection, maybe meters. Although we'll talk more about meters next week, because smart meters are certainly a different kind of cost than old-fashioned meters were. But with between $6 and $9, that's a customer charge that's recovering billing and collection and maybe meters. And then at the bottom, we have a couple that are above $15 a month. And at that point, the utility is pretty clearly recovering some distribution costs in the monthly customer charge. But what we're seeing now is a little more dramatic. Earlier this year, Madison Gas and Electric submitted a request for a monthly charge of $69 a month, in which they were proposing to recover all of their investment in power plants, transmission, distribution, and their operating costs, and have a 4-cent a kilowatt hour energy rate for the residential class to simply recover fuel and purchase power costs. That was pretty dramatic. That's not the way it's going forward for Madison, but it's an example of kind of the extreme change that some utilities have been seeking. Now, there's a number of adverse impacts of high fixed charges. First, urban and apartment dwellers live close together. They tend to have low usage. Because they're close together, many of them share a transformer. There's lots of them per mile of distribution line. They're much cheaper to serve. But with high fixed charges, the fact that they're cheaper to serve doesn't get reflected in the price. They say that pay the same distribution cost as large homes in suburban and rural areas. The second adverse impact is that low-income consumers get hit pretty hard with high fixed charges because their usage tends to be substantially below the average level. The third is that energy efficiency impacts are quite severe, and I'll talk about that, how we calculate that. So here I've put together three hypothetical rates. I started with a 15-cent per kilowatt hour flat rate, no customer charge, and all kilowatt hours at 15 cents. And I use that as the baseline to measure the impacts. And the first alternative I tested was an inclining block rate, also with no customer charge. This is kind of like the rate design in Palo Alto, except it's 2 blocks instead of 3. And when I used a very mild elasticity factor of -0.2 to calculate how much additional consumption would occur by the small number of relatively small number of customers, a very small amount of usage that ends in the first block, and savings in the second block from a higher price, I calculated about 2.6% reduction in usage. Then the third rate design that I examined here is a high customer charge with a $25 customer charge and a flat rate. And if we recovered $25 in the customer charge, there would be less revenue requirement to recover in the per kilowatt hour charge, so that drops to about 10 cents. Using the same elasticity factor, I computed that there would be about a 6.3% increase in usage compared with the flat rate. So the difference between an inclining block rate and a high customer charge rate is about 9% in usage. That's about equal to a whole decade of electric utility energy efficiency program achievement. So that's pretty significant what rate design can do. This is a graphic that comes out of our RAPS paper on time varying and dynamic pricing. And what it shows is, starting with a flat rate, how much risk is there to the customer and how much reward is there to the customer from shifting their usage from on-peak hours to off-peak hours. And what it shows is that the inclining block rate design seasonal rate design, and time of use rate design all have some significant impact. And obviously, as I've shown, you can combine inclining block rates, seasonal rates, and time of use rates to get peak load benefits that are pretty significant, but not as great as you get with critical peak pricing, real-time pricing, or the more sophisticated rate designs that we'll talk about next week. You get me? So let's take a look at how much of that benefit we can get. Here I'm just comparing a time of use rate to an inclining block rate. On the left of time of use rate with an 8-cent off-peak rate and a 15-cent on-peak rate. And on the right, an inclining block rate with a 8-cent first block and a 15-cent second block. Because we know from looking at the bill frequency data for the utility that about 80% of the usage in the peak months is by customers using above 500 kilowatt hours a month, we know that 80% of the usage under the inclining block rate that would, in those months, will be subject to that 15-cent rate, the same rate that we have on the left for the time of use rate. So we would estimate that this inclining block rate would achieve about 80% of the peak load benefits of the time of use rate. I'm going to stop there to see if there are clarifying questions at this point before I go into my final topic.
Jim, I don't think there are clarifying questions per se, so I would recommend you keep going.
All right.
Jim, this is Deb. We did have one just come in at the very last moment. It refers to slide 30. And the question is, what is meant by customer risk? On that same slide, I have another question.
Okay. What was meant in this particular slide by the author of this paper was that with an inclining or seasonal rate, customers can pretty well know in advance and control their usage and not have a lot of risk of a surprise in their bill. With time of use pricing and the more dynamic pricing, they have to pay closer attention to their usage patterns in order on a day-to-day or hour-to-hour basis in order to avoid the risk of a substantial variance in the size of their bill.
Thanks so much. And a really quick question came in on 29 as well. There's actually two questions on that same issue, and that is where did the elasticity of negative 0.2 come from? And does that mean a 20% increase?
A elasticity of minus 0.2 means that a 1% change in price is expected to produce a 0.2% reduction in consumption. Elasticity studies show elasticities between minus 0.1 and minus 0.7 depending on what type of use they're measuring and over what period of time. Over a long period of time, people replace appliances and have higher elasticities. I chose minus 0.2 because it's at the low conservative end. And it's what I would expect to be realized within 2 to 5 years of a rate change. I would expect elasticity over the 10 to 20 year period to be higher than that. All right, so I'm going to wrap up now by talking about bill simplification. I think this is important. Now, I'm just ask you all a question. Most of you probably buy gasoline sometimes, and you see signs that look like this, although they're, at least here, they're a little lower than that now, which is kind of good news, I guess. So is that kind of pricing approach more useful to you, or would you rather have the gas station give you a complete breakdown of the price of your gasoline for crude oil and the tanker and the refinery and the pipeline and the truck that brings it to the mini-mart and the mini-mart's profit and the state taxes and the federal taxes? Most of us would prefer the kind of pricing that you see on the right. But we're confusing customers with electric bills. This is an illustration of an electric bill of a utility that has, this is for a customer with 1,266 kilowatt hours of consumption. It's a 3-block inclining block rate, 4.6 cents, 6 cents, and 8 cents above 1,000 kilowatt hours. But then I've got a fuel adjustment rate, an infrastructure tracker, a little decoupling decrease, a conservation program charge, nuclear decommissioning, a subtotal of $126, and then state tax and city tax on top of that. And the customer's bill is $140.60. And what a customer can't easily see from this bill is how much they will save if they use less electricity or how much they will pay if they use more. Here's what this rate design really means. It means the first 500 kilowatt hours are 9.3 cents. The next 500 are 11.5, and above that we're at almost 14 cents a kilowatt hour. Our electric bills have basically become a litigator's scorecard or an accountant's worksheet. If we want consumers to respond to prices, they need to understand those prices. What the consumer should see is understandable pricing that shows the net effect on them. If you want if you want customers to respond to the rate, simplify the bill. And now I'll hand it back to Janine for a wrap-up.
Thank you, Jim. So the one thing I want to leave you with is some thoughts about why is rate design so very important, and why is it becoming a more important issue today than it might have been in years past. And part of that has to do with the impact of distributed energy resources. We find ourselves in a situation where many more customers are taking advantage of energy efficiency and installing photovoltaic units on their roofs. Businesses are installing them at their places as well. And so as a result of that, utilities are concerned that they're losing their opportunities to recover their revenues through sales. But at the same time, policymakers want to encourage customers to continue to use distributed energy resources for a whole host of reasons, including it's a lower cost option, it can provide benefits to the environment, provides more energy security, independence, and a whole host of other reasons. And then the third part of the third player in this whole scenario are the consumers who do not engage in distributed energy resources. Maybe they can't afford to, which is a good portion of customers can't afford to do it, or they're just not interested in doing it. And so the concern is that as more customers drop off the system because they're taking steps to address their own energy use, that the remaining customers not be left having to make up that revenue shortfall. And this is the issue that's under discussion a whole lot, and it's coming to the fore and being discussed in cases dealing with net metering and how that should be priced, as well as other rate cases where traditional rate designs are being reviewed and looked at again. So I just wanted to leave you with these thoughts of what are some of the new frontiers in rate design and why all this matters. And some of that, Jim, if you would go to the next slide, please. Some of that will be addressed in the next 201 class next week, where we talk a bit about net metering. And at this point, I'm going to open it up for questions. We got a lot of questions in advance and some more new questions today, and I'd like to thank you all for those questions. They're quite good. So I'm just going to go ahead and dig into the questions. And the first question I have is a question regarding low-income customers. Jim, what would make a fair method to take into account social and environmental externalities and their impact to rate making?
There are a number of different ways this is done in many parts of the world. In Indonesia, for example, the government owns hydroelectric dams, and they've basically dedicated the low-cost power that those dams produce to meet the essential needs of residential customers. That's a cost-based approach. In the U.S., many utilities and regulators have established explicit discounts for low-income customers. Some of those are a 20% or 30% discount. Some of them that economists tend to favor are eliminating the customer charge for low-income customers, so they see the same incentive to use energy wisely as other customers but get lower bills. And then others have put together more complicated systems with, for example, a percentage of income payment that customers are able to sign up for. And they're assured that their electric bills won't exceed a defined percentage of their income. This is mostly a political and policy decision for the regulator, not so much a technical one, except in the case where there is a low-cost resource that can be dedicated to that purpose. But an inclining block rate design will generally favor low-income customers because they're less likely to have air conditioning, swimming pools, and other appliances that drive their second and third refrigerators, those sorts of things that drive usage up. And so an inclining block rate design both reflects costs because for the reasons that I discussed earlier, but also generally provides a net benefit to low-income customers.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take another 2 quick questions on low-income issues, and then we're going to move on to a whole host of other topics. We have quite a few questions here. So the next question is, with regard to low-income rates, what is the impact of fixed charges on revenue volatility?
The more money the utility recovers in the fixed charge, the less exposed that utility is to revenue variation due to changes in usage. And from the customer's perspective, the customer bills are more stable. That is, they're very high on a per kilowatt hour basis in the low use months, but they don't rise as much in the high use months. And most regulators have chosen to address the revenue volatility issue for the utility without reverting to high fixed charges. Many have adopted revenue regulation or decoupling mechanisms or lost revenue mechanisms to make sure the utility's revenue remains stable so that the price signal to the consumer remains focused on usage elements of rates.
And the third question, thank you, is what are the principles to consider when designing ideal low-income rates?
Well, Janine, I'm going to want you to help me with this because you've worked on this from the policy side. From a technical analyst perspective, the fact that low-income customers tend to have below-average usage, but a small number have high usage, tells me that a rate design that is focused on usage will benefit most, and for those high-use customers, targeting the utility's energy efficiency program to help them get their usage down is probably a good policy approach. Janine, you may have some other thoughts on this one.
Actually, that's exactly what I was going to say, because there's been studies that show that there is a correlation between income and usage, and that low-income customers tend to use less. So they would benefit from either an inclining block or a very explicit low-use rate that the utility might put forward to try to encourage customers to stay beneath a certain threshold, which is achievable for low-income customers. Certainly, you also want to avoid high fixed charges on those bills as well.
There's also a lot of studies that show an expected relationship between income and energy efficiency. Higher income people are more likely to have a new refrigerator that's high efficiency, other new appliances that are high efficiency. And so the fact that low income households use less energy than average, despite having lower efficiency appliances than average, tells me that there's a tremendous opportunity to address the usage side of the equation for low-income households, and many utilities have done so. My own utility has a
program that in essence provides a free high efficiency refrigerator to low-income households as a way of helping them get their usage down into the first block of an inclining block rate design.
Thank you, Jim. The next question we have is, could you please discuss the implications of the differences between a monthly fixed charge and a minimum rate?
The monthly fixed charge collects $5 or $10 or $25 at zero usage. A minimum bill, and some of the California utilities are good examples of minimum bills, have no separately stated customer charge, but if you use less than some minimum number of kilowatt hours, you still get a bill for $5 or $10 a month. The minimum bill approach reserves the vast majority of the revenue requirement for the per kilowatt hour rate, so you encourage greater attention to usage. Only a small number of customers, representing a very small percentage of the usage, are actually affected by the minimum bill. But for those customers, the utility is assured of receiving a known amount of revenue from those customers every month, even at zero usage. A minimum bill works quite well for addressing utilities that have a lot of vacation homes, because those tend to go down to or close to zero during the non-usage months, and it's viewed as a fair way to collect some costs from customers that are not on the system all year round.
And Jim, can you comment on straight fixed variable pricing and what costs might still be in the variable portion?
Yeah, there are a couple of different approaches to straight fixed variable pricing, and it's a type of pricing that you don't see in any other industry. Only only monopoly utilities can implement that kind of pricing, because it really is an exercise of monopoly pricing power. Some utilities, some electric cooperatives around the country have established monthly fixed charges and $25 a month or higher to recover the majority of their distribution costs, and they tend to recover only their power supply production and transmission costs in the per kilowatt hour price. And that's a common approach to straight fixed variable pricing. The Madison Gas and Electric proposal of $69 that I showed actually had the cost, the investment related costs of power plants included in the monthly charge. And it almost at that point becomes an all-you-can-eat rate, because the per kilowatt hour charge becomes so low that you're going to see people switching from gas to electric space heat. The impacts that would have on a utility would be quite dramatic. The impacts of a very high rate like that on urban and apartment dwellers would be quite dramatic.
Thank you, Jim. Another question, which is a rather broad question, but the question is, in regard to rate design, what are the best practices, pros and cons, in states and utilities that use them?
Wow. Well, I guess there's some principles that I see is that most states allow customers to connect to the grid for no more than the cost of connecting to the grid. That is, their monthly charges are no more than the customer-specific costs. The service drop from the pole to the house, the meter reading and billing, and customer service costs, and keeping all of the shared system costs in the usage rates. A second best practice that I think we'll discuss next week is to, when you're doing cost allocation studies, to clearly differentiate between baseload and peaking resource costs, and so that you don't undercharge or overcharge users who are primarily relying on baseload resources. The coal and nuclear plants are pretty expensive, and the cost of building the basic grid to provide people with service at all hours is pretty expensive. Garfield and Lovejoy, one of the authors of Public Utility Economics, had a kind of a list of criteria that Any customer that uses the system at any time should contribute to system costs. That those who use power during peak times should contribute more to system costs than those who do so at off-peak times. But even a 100% interruptible customer should make some contribution to the system costs in addition to the operating costs that they incur. And I think the Garfield and Lovejoy's principles are good. There are also Bonbright's principles. Professor Bonbright, the author of Principles of Public Utility Rates, identified a number of criteria for rate design to be fair and perceived to be fair, to encourage efficiency in the use of electricity, and to provide a predictable revenue to the utility. So I'll leave those as two of the lions of the field's principles.
Okay. And switching now to the subject of on-demand, is there good data on the distribution of residential customers' peak demand, and does it correlate with house size?
Smart meters provide excellent data on residential customers' peak demand, and I've worked with one utility that installed smart meters throughout its system about 4 years ago and is now finally at the point where the quality of the data is very good. And we're seeing very distinct changes compared with research studies that were done 15 and 20 years ago, showing much higher levels of use of residential air conditioning during hot afternoons. The residential class, in the earlier study was determined to be responsible for about 20% of usage during the highest peak hours, and now it's more like 30%. So the data that smart meters provide is very good. Now, you don't need smart meters on every customer to get that data. Frankly, you can put a smart meter on each. You can just record the hourly data for the residential circuits, and you get that data for residential customers as a whole. And so it's not necessary to have a full smart meter system to know what residential demand is. You can do that at the circuit level. But smart meters provide that data all the way down to the individual customer, the individual transformer, and provide tremendous tools for utilities to know when transformers need to be upsized, and to design rates that we'll talk about next week to target those specific hours of usage.
Well, following up from that question is another question that as to whether or not, and maybe this is something you'll get into more next week, but should we move to a three-part rate structure for all customers?
A three-part rate structure, I'm not going to go all the way back to that slide, would mean a separately stated demand charge, energy charge, and customer charge. And the classic form of that would have the customer charge recover the metering and billing costs, the demand charge recover the distribution system costs based upon each customer's highest 1 hour of usage, and the energy charge recover the power supply costs, and it would be could be a time differentiated energy charge, but all the generation and transmission costs in that energy charge. And that would be a pretty classic type of rate form. The principal reason that to be concerned about that is that residential customers are not very likely to understand a demand charge. I worked with a utility that had a demand charge in its water rate, and we were going to survey the customers to find out how many of them understood it, but we started with the customer service staff that answered their questions when they called, and we found that none of them actually understood it, and we didn't feel like we needed to go on and ask the customers if they understood how it worked. So as part of bill simplification and rate simplification, kind of argues against a residential demand charge. What many utilities do in this country, and a few in this country and quite a few in other countries, is they have it's called a panel size charge. If you have a 100 amp panel, you pay $5 a month for service. If you have a 200 amp panel, you pay $10. If you have a 400 amp panel, you pay $20. And that's a little easier for customers to understand. It also protects the apartment customer who has a pretty small panel, and they wind up with smaller bills, and the larger customers with larger houses, more appliances, get higher charges. I'll show next week some demand charge rates, one from France and one I think from Canada, and discuss those. They may make sense in some places, but customer understanding is the real tough question there.
Okay. And how common are residential tiered rates, higher charges for homes with higher demand? And how are those tiers developed?
Residential inclining block rates are almost universal for the investor-owned utilities in the western U.S. Idaho, Washington, Oregon, California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado, and fairly common in some other places, although we're seeing, the examples that I showed earlier show a lot of seasonal rate design, increasing focus on time of use rate design. There's really, the slide that I showed earlier on the various justifications for tiered rates usually drive the rate blocks. Where I live, the utilities have a limited amount. I live in Olympia, Washington. The utilities have a limited amount of low-cost hydropower, and everything above that is coming from either a thermal power source or a renewable energy source, and in either way, it's a lot more expensive than the hydro. And so the first block tends to be a hydro block, and we've seen that in a lot of places. In some places, it's the first block is based upon the high load factor usage. That is, the lights and appliances are a year-round usage that's relative. People leave their refrigerators on all night long, and they certainly don't do that with their other appliances. And so the first block in that situation reflects a high load factor use that has can rely on baseload power plants that are cheaper. And that's the method that's been used in a lot of states to set tiered rates. And finally, some are just overtly set to either encourage energy efficiency or to reward frugality. And I'll call them policy-based rates rather than technically based rates. And that's the role of the policymaker.
Thank you. The next question we have goes to allocation and what is the rationale between setting residential and industrial rates. And the person with the question indicated that in their state the industrial rates are half of what the residential rates are.
I'm going to back all the way up to my cost allocation study slide here, which unfortunately is way up here at the beginning. The logic is that first of all, industrial customers generally don't use the distribution system at all. They take their power at high voltage, and so in the allocation process, those costs from the distribution system that get classified as energy and demand related don't get allocated to the industrial customers. Also, industrial customers tend to use power at a more steady rate than residential or small business customers, and so the demand related costs per kilowatt hour are lower. Now in this example here, I still left fairly high distribution. I showed fairly high distribution costs for industrial customers. This was an urban utility for whom this is data from an actual utility that I've worked with, and it was an urban utility for whom the industrial customers were pretty much single shift operations. They weren't three-shift operations that you would see in manufacturing or materials processing, an oil refinery or a smelter or something like that. In an oil refinery or a smelter, we would see those distribution costs be essentially zero.
because they would be taking power at the transmission voltage level. And that's why those rate differentials occur. But as we'll discuss next week, some of this has to do with whether costs, how costs are classified, how baseload power plant costs are treated in the allocation study. And that's the most controversial part of rate making. And we'll talk about that next week.
Yes, and we're getting up to close to 2 o'clock, so I'm going to ask one more question right now, but we're going to continue on until 2:30. So anyone who wants to stay on the line, I've tried to prioritize the questions that were most on point with today's presentation. Here is another one that was just about to ask her question. She's left. But I think, let me move on and ask the question regarding what are the best alternatives to straight fixed variable rates?
Well, first of all, I don't think straight fixed variable, personally, I don't think straight fixed variable rates are a good alternative at all. They're not something, the purpose for which utility regulation was created was to prevent the exercise of monopoly pricing power. The grocery store doesn't charge you a reservation fee or a fixed charge for the privilege of buying groceries. You come in and you buy what you want and you pay for what you take. And oil refineries have huge fixed costs and they recover it 1 gallon at a time. Hotels have high fixed costs and they recover it 1 room night at a time. So I start with the premise that a straight fixed variable rate is anathema to what utility regulation was created to address, and all the way back to the court case of Munn versus Illinois in, I think, 1848, dealing with grain elevators. It's exercising monopoly pricing power. That said, if the regulator thinks that the utility needs a more stable revenue stream, I think that the best way to address that is with a revenue regulation mechanism, such as the attrition decoupling mechanism used in California, or the revenue per customer decoupling mechanisms used in many, many other states, that at the end of the year they determine how much of the allowed revenue requirement the utility actually recovered, and then implement a small surcharge or credit to collect or refund the difference between the allowed revenue and the actual revenue over the subsequent year. That to me is the best solution, is to design rates to fully reflect long-run incremental costs when in the long run, all costs are variable, and to address the revenue stability issue another way. A second best rate, second best approach, I think, is something like the panel size charge that I discussed that I'll put in next week's presentation. And France is probably the best example of that, where customers pay an increasing amount per month based upon how large their connection size is. And then everybody pays the same price per kilowatt hour. And that way the apartment dwellers and the very frugal users are not adversely impacted. But the utility does wind up with a very predictable revenue stream.
Okay. The next question is, how should dispatchable electric vehicle charging rates be designed to compensate customers to reflect avoided distribution costs?
REP has a excellent paper on this that our European group published earlier this year. That's available on our website on pricing for electric vehicles. The electric vehicles take many hours to charge. The last thing in the world you want is to have them charging in the late afternoon when the sun is going down and solar systems are not producing power, but the air conditioning loads are still high. So the simplest answer is a time of use rate works to make sure the electric vehicles are not charging at the most critical hours. Most electric vehicles in Nissan Leaf or a Tesla, the charge controller allows you to delay or schedule the
the charge time, and having a very deep, very low midnight rate, I'll call it, a 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. rate, is another attractive way. I think the best, and we're going to talk about this, I hope, next week, is a critical peak pricing rate with interactive controls, so that either the electric vehicle charger gets the signal from the utility that the price of electricity is cheap and charges then, or gets a signal that it's expensive and stops charging, or the utility actually has direct load control over the charger and can turn it on or off as needed to balance the system. In the future, we may see vehicle-to-grid rates where the vehicles actually feed power. We use their batteries for storage on the system, but those are still in development.
Okay, we have a question that said that they want a clarification that, did you say that your modeling gives equivalent results for inclining block and time of use rates? And the questioner indicates that her experience is that consumers are more able to control time of use rates. Do you have a comment on that?
There is research on both sides of that question. There's some excellent research that was done some years ago that showed that customers actually have higher elasticity to upper blocks, which would tell us that inclining block rates would be more effective. And there certainly is also recent research, and Sacramento published a study last month of a pilot program they ran that showed that customers had very substantial response to a time of use price, and actually gave a long list of things that people did in response to it. I think there are alternative ways to accomplish the same thing. Personally, I think they can be combined to get the best of both.
Okay, and a follow-up question to that by someone else. Wanted clarification that is the suggestion that inclining block rates yield similar energy use reductions to TOU rates, time of use rates, primarily true only for the summer peaking utilities, or is it true elsewhere?
Well, on a winter peaking utility, the customer would see the upper blocks in the winter, not in the summer, and that's the case where I live. This is a winter peaking region, and our the part of the intent of the inclining block rate is to be a seasonal rate. That more customers see the upper block, that's when the space heat comes on, and it's more expensive to serve. The peaking resources are devoted to that, but some of the rate examples I showed were summer peaking regions, like Iowa, that had some winter space heat customers that, if from their perspective, were soaking up surplus capacity in the winter and were given very attractive rates in order to keep their heating bills reasonable. So I think it's a location-specific question. What are the characteristics of cost in your region of the country?
Okay, and another question is, putting aside for the moment the tie between pricing and reducing or increasing electric usage, doesn't economic theory suggest that recovering fixed costs through a fixed charge and variable costs through a variable charge should lead to the most economically efficient allocation of resources?
Quite simply, the answer to that is no. In the competitive world, fixed costs are all recovered through variable charges, whether it's gasoline or hotel rooms or airplane seats, or a company that makes desks has a fixed cost for its factory, but it recovers them one desk at a time. The problem is that in the long run, all costs are variable, and ideally rates should reflect long-run costs. That is, where are we going? Not short-run costs, which is what do we have right now? Because customers make decisions on what appliances to buy, how much to insulate their homes, what kind of an air conditioner to install,
based upon, in part, how much they expect to cost to operate those appliances. And if we're not telling them the long-run cost of their decision, we're not giving them the information that they need to make an efficient choice.
Okay. I have a question saying, can you go back to slide 31 and explain the 80% in the inclining block and the TOU comparison again?
I'm happy to do that. So this, just to remind folks, this is a TOU rate that's 8 cents off peak and 15 cents on peak, and an inclining block rate that's 8 cents for the first 500 kilowatt hours and 15 cents above that. We would expect from the bill frequency, if you set the inclining block, the block, at, say 50% of average usage, which is pretty typical for the design of an inclining block rate. You're going to expect 80% of the consumption to be by customers who see the tail block as the price on which they decide whether to use more electricity or less. So 80% of the customers, or 80% of the usage will see that 15-cent price as their decision price during all hours, including the on-peak hours. And 20% of the usage would see the first is by customers who use less than 500 kilowatt. In the example that I had, it was only 8%. A small percentage will see that 500 first block rate as their decision price. The overwhelming majority of usage will see that tail block as their decision price, so they'll be seeing the same 15 cents that they would have seen in on-peak hours under a time of use rate. Now, they're going to see that on-peak and off-peak. They're going to have an incentive to reduce their usage on-peak and to reduce their usage off-peak, whereas with the time of use rate, the incentive is focused in the on-peak hours. But you would expect to see about 80%, because of 80% or more of the consumption is by customers who see that second block rate. We would expect about 80% of the peak load benefits to result. 15 cents, whether it's all hours or peak hours, is going to reduce the consumption by about the same amount in the peak hours.
Thank you, Jim. The next comment is states that the utility perspective is important, but the commenter says, I think this seminar is missing an appropriate balance to address critical efficiency and environmental considerations that are also essential in CAPS for fair rate design. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I've tried to stick with what the history and evolution of utility regulation has been. I've tried to show what utilities have been seeking in the form of higher focus on fixed charges, but I've mostly focused on the variety of different kinds of rate designs, flat rates, inclining block rates, time of use rates, and combinations of them, seasonal rates, that are used to address the efficiency issues that differ from region to region and from utility to utility. Obviously, there's an effort on the part of utilities to increase fixed charges. As an economist, I look at how regulation is supposed to instill in utilities the pricing discipline that the competitive market imposes on competitive businesses, and I see that effort on the part of utilities to be, in essence, an anti-competitive effort. It's troubling to me professionally.
Thank you for those comments. Another question is with respect to Indiana. It says, with regard to Indiana, let me ask you a question for us in Indiana. Without a detailed electric bill, consumers have no idea or ability to understand what parts of their electric bills are responsible for various policies. For example, politicians can blame the U.S. EPA for air quality regulation compliance rather perhaps the real reason. for why the rates are high?
Putting all the detail on the back of the bill is fine so that customers can see where their money is going. But just as it's possible to figure out what the cost of a gallon of gasoline is. But what really matters to the customer is not all the detail that can be on the back of the bill, but what it really means to them. That is how much they will incur if they use more, how much they will save if they use less. That means taking all of the blocks, all of the tariff riders, all of the taxes and rolling them into the price so that the price for electricity, so that this example customer can see that if they use more electricity, it's going to be at 13.7 cents a kilowatt hour. Having all of this information allows the customer to, if they care, to know where their money is going, but it doesn't actually give them any information as to how much they can save if they use less or how much they will spend if they use more. It's just too complicated. So, the answer is to have a simple rolled up rate like a gasoline price where the bill is calculated, and then have all of the detail such as this available to customers to look at if they choose to do so.
Okay. Another question is, as utilities move to provide more energy efficiency, many advocate for the fixed charge as a place to pay for this. But as you mentioned, that can be a disincentive to renewable energy and energy efficiency. How can we better pay for energy as services?
It's a little strange to be thinking that they had it right in the 50s, that a customer should pay enough to connect to the grid to cover the cost of connecting to the grid, and they should pay for grid services in proportion to how much they use. I think that we'll talk about this next week when we talk about net metering and alternatives to net metering, that a time of use price, and if the highest cost is from 5 to 8 p.m., then that's going to where the highest price is going to be. And the solar system isn't going to be producing. The customer will be taking power from the grid, and they'll pay for grid services and power supply at a time varying rate. And when they're feeding power back to the grid, if it happens to arrive to the utility at a time that it's valuable, the utility would credit a time of use price that's high. And if it arrives on a Sunday afternoon when the power is not particularly valuable to the utility, the price the utility would credit would be lower. A time of use price for that customer as opposed to a flat rate may be a simple solution to the question of how do we cover the cost of grid services from those who are using them.
Okay, another question is, what do you feel the impacts are of high fixed charges for solar customers?
We're seeing an effect of that in Hawaii already. They're not actually high fixed charges, they're just barriers to connection, where customers are getting put in a year-long queue for interconnection. And what customers are doing is they're installing battery banks and disconnecting from the utility entirely. Now, in a very high-cost utility region like Hawaii, that's feasible for a well-to-do customer that can afford to take out a lease on a battery bank. And I think we'll see that spread to the mainland if more utilities are allowed to impose high fixed charges. And they'll, the phone companies tried this 20 years ago. They started having $30 a month line access charges instead of $6. And since then, they've lost 40% of their access lines to technological innovation. And I can see the electric utilities inviting the same kind of technological innovation to steal their business if they exercise monopoly pricing power and they're not in fact able to enforce that monopoly because of technological change.
Okay. Another question is, someone was interested in very small utilities and adjusting rates as renewables are introduced. Do you have any comments on how that could be addressed or done?
I've worked with utilities. Well, I've worked with utilities with only a few hundred consumers. So I've got some experience working with small utilities in Alaska and rural electric cooperatives. And they do have a very kind of a special situation in that they may not have the deep financial reserves of a large utility. They don't have the diverse customer base that a large utility has. They may not be spread across multiple states and multiple climate zones. And so it's either hot or it's cold in their service territory. It's either an extreme year or a mild year in their entire service territory, and their revenues are a little more volatile. And adding renewable distributed energy resource to their system can increase that volatility. I think the answers remain pretty similar, which is the revenue volatility should be dealt with outside of the rate design, because the rate design is supposed to be giving an efficient pricing signal for the long run, not based upon short-run cost changes. Or the customer is going to be misled into making inefficient investments. So a revenue decoupling mechanism, or a simplified one, I actually worked with a water utility with 4,000 customers and helped them implement a decoupling light mechanism. Just if sales dropped below a certain level, there was a 1% increase in the price for every 3% decrease in sales. And so there's some simple approaches there. Time of use rates, I think, are going to be the norm and are probably the best way of addressing renewable energy customers, so that when they're taking power from the grid at hours that it's stressful for the grid, they're contributing heavily to the cost of grid services.
And continuing on that theme of time of use rates, have you seen any time of use rates begin to account for summer peaking happening later in the day from the 5 to 9 p.m. time frame as opposed to the 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. time frame?
It's a good question. Historically, time of use rates were mostly kind of noon to 6, and with high levels of solar, later hours are becoming the challenging ramping hours. So we've got a paper on this called "Teaching the Duck to Fly" that looks at the California duck curve with very high ramping needs in the late afternoon. And we are seeing that particularly in critical peak pricing pilot programs. Sacramento's that I mentioned earlier has a 3-hour critical peak period, and it was focused on 4 to 7 p.m. or 5 to 8 p.m. And the results of that pilot were very encouraging. So I think we are seeing time of use rates move that direction. I know one utility I'm working with right now has had a noon to 6 time of use period, and they're doing load research right now to determine what the proper hours are. They had copied a nearby major utilities rate design because the grocery stores and office buildings had operations across city lines, and now they're saying, well, that's not really optimal. So they're looking at tightening up the number of hours, getting the rate more focused, and figuring out exactly which hours are important as their resource mix is changing.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question which asks, what are some strategies that PUCs could use to incent energy efficiency while also seeking to increase the customer charge?
Well, one thing that a number of regulators have done is to increase the customer charge, but to decrease the first block rate by an offsetting amount. We see that in areas with a lot of vacation property. So instead of being $5 a month and 10 cents a kilowatt hour flat rate, it becomes $25 a month. The first 500 is 5 cents, and above that is 12 or 13 or 14 cents. So that the inclining block rate is set so that the typical customer that's actually living there and using 3 or 4 or 5 or 600 kilowatt hours doesn't see a significant change in their bill. But the true vacation home that's using 0 kilowatt hours still pays a $25 or $30 a month fixed charge. That's I think one approach that I've seen work on the pricing side. And then the regulatory commission can, in this state of Washington, requires utilities to have programs designed to acquire all cost-effective energy efficiency based on long-run costs. And we have a number of utilities in the state that have, flat rates and some that have high fixed charges. They're required to run programs designed to acquire all of the cost-effective conservation. And the incentives that they have to pay customers to participate are much higher, because the rate design isn't providing as much incentive for the customer to want to invest their own money in the efficiency measures. So there's a trade-off for the utility there.
Okay, and another question is with regard to rate design options, how common or popular or rare are time of use and other pricing options?
Well, time of use has become almost universally available as an optional rate among major utilities in the U.S. And I will predict that in 10 years it will be almost universal as the default rate design among major utilities in the U.S. And part of the, 10 years ago, the cost of metering for time of use rates or more dynamic rates was very high. The cost of data processing was quite high. Today, that cost of metering and data processing, we now carry as much processing power in our pocket as NASA had when we put people on the moon. So the cost of collecting and processing that data has gotten much lower. So I think we'll see time varying rates become universal. I think the issue will then become that the critical peak rates will probably remain. That is, we'll talk about those next week, but will probably remain as optional rates.
Okay. The next question is, why isn't revenue decoupling sufficient to address utility concerns about recovery without needing to advocate for higher fixed rates?
Well, to take a utility's perspective, the revenue decoupling does give the utility assurance that it will recover its allowed revenue requirement, and in that sense should be sufficient. Some utilities are raising the point, and Janine, I think you mentioned this earlier in one of your slides, that are expressing concern that customers that are conserving or investing in solar systems and reducing their take from the system are shifting costs to the remaining customers and are expressing concern about the have-not customers, those that can do not or cannot afford to invest in alternatives. And if that's really a problem, there's a solution available, which is to provide financial assistance to those customers so that they can participate in the energy efficiency programs. But if the regulator is not willing to implement or doesn't have the authority to require the utilities to make those efficiency programs available, then the cost shift may become a real problem. Janine, I don't know, maybe you have some experience from what happened with natural gas in Ohio, where higher fixed charges were introduced, as to how it affected the low income versus other customers.
Well, there was a lot of protest among customer groups, especially low-income customers, because the charge went in some instances from $19 up to as much as $25 per month, irrespective of how much you used, irrespective if you were in the home. And that did cause a hardship for a lot of customers. And so there are better ways of designing rates, and I think when Jim talked about decoupling, I think decoupling is a good way to kind of address the issue of providing the incentives for energy efficiency and also giving the utility the option to recover its revenues. So that might be a good way to go to address both of those concerns. We have time for just one more question, and some of these questions I've held because I think they fit more into the next topic area, as does this one. But what would a feed-in tariff look like for a typical utility?
The term feed-in tariff is usually taken to mean a incentive rate above the value to the utility of renewable energy that is designed to provide a return on the investment of a renewable energy developer on their resource, which may not be cost effective to stand alone. And that's how they were implemented in Europe and in Tallahassee. Sometimes the term is used to mean any tariff that has a defined price that the utility pays for power that is fed into their system, even if it's 2 cents. But the European feed-in tariffs were 20 and 30 and even 50 cents a kilowatt hour. And were overtly designed to be above market incentives for the development of renewable energy. And most of those, in Tallahassee, I think it's Jacksonville was the municipal utility that had, U.S. one that had a strong feed-in tariff, were higher for small solar systems than for large ones, and higher for solar systems because of their on-peak orientation than for wind systems, which were in areas where the wind blows at night. So the feed-in tariffs in many cases were technology specific. We'll talk about alternatives to net metering and approaches that I expect we'll see more utilities use in next week's webinar.
Well, Jim, thank you for all your answers to these questions, and I would like to thank all of the participants who sat in on this webinar for your attention to it. It will be posted on our public website so that you can review the entire webinar. Feel free to get in touch with us with more questions and comments, and we hope to see you next week on November 14th for our next webinar. And with that, I'd like to thank you all and terminate this webinar for today. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.